Howdy-ho, neighbor. I plan on titling this video An Argument for the Resurrection of Jesus, depending on whether I get through the whole thing or not. I don't know. I may break it up into multiple videos. Interesting thing is you know how long this video is going to be, and I don't, because I'm just now recording it. But you're watching it live, or not live, you're watching it on YouTube. Anywho, since I'm calling this, or I may call this An Argument for the Resurrection of Jesus, I suspect some people are going to stumble on this video who have not watched all the previous videos leading up to this point. And so for that reason, I want to give a little bit of an introduction here to explain to people who are new to the channel what's going on. First of all, if you traffic in Christian apologetics, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian or whatever, then I'm probably not going to say anything in this video that you have not already heard. And two, I'm probably not going to, it's not going to be as good. It's probably going to be worse than other things you've heard. And the reason for that is because I'm going to try to do it all off the top of my head. I'm not going to use any notes or outlines or anything like that. And the reason I'm doing that is because the goal in having this channel and doing all these videos isn't to talk people into Christianity or defend Christianity or anything. That's secondary. The primary goal, I'm sorry, I just had a Dr. Pepper. The primary goal is to overcome my inability to speak very well. I'm not a very good speaker, and it's carried over into not just speaking in front of a camera, which is really difficult, but having normal conversations with people or monologuing or just any kind of speech is very hard for me. I'm starting to suspect, as I've said in earlier videos, that I might have aphasia. Anyway, that's why I'm doing this without notes and stuff, because I kind of want to be able to talk without a teleprompter kind of thing. So don't get your hopes up about the quality of this video. That's basically what I'm saying. Okay, so let me get into the argument for the resurrection. Oh yeah, I guess the third thing to say is that this video is not intended to be a standalone video. I have a whole series of videos that came before this one that kind of led up to this point. In the first part, I explained my epistemology, how I think that we can know things. That's important for everything that came after. After that, I talked about idealism, naturalism, and dualism, and I defended dualism. And so if you're a naturalist, of course, you're not going to find this nearly as persuasive as you would if you were a dualist. And then I went on and said, because if naturalism was true, of course, nobody can rise from the dead. And then after that, I made arguments for God. And the God that I ended up with at the end of it, although it doesn't prove it's the Christian God, it does show that it's something very much like the Christian God. And so it does give us reason to suspect that Judaism, Christianity, or Islam might be true and are worth looking into. So that all of that worldview stuff is going to come into play whenever you're trying to evaluate whether a miracle happened, like a resurrection or something like that. If you don't believe in God, obviously a miracle is going to be a lot harder to believe than it would be if you did believe in God. So all the videos that I made in the past are relevant to this video. And I also started a video on historical stuff. First I talked about the sources, like the Bible, and whether we can use the Bible as a source, whether the Bible's been preserved, whether it records history, or if it's all metaphor or whatever. That's all relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today. I also talked about messianic expectation, and I explained, what messianic expectation is. I'm going to remind you of some of the stuff I said in there, but I'm not going to try to defend that in this video because I defended that in previous videos. I also defended the claim that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, which I'm also not going to defend in this video. I'm just going to state it. So all that stuff is, plays into this video. Also in the last video, I talked about what the New Testament authors meant when they said Jesus was raised from the dead, and what they meant by resurrection in general. I went into detail, well, maybe not a whole lot of detail, but I talked a little bit about Jewish beliefs and resurrection and what they meant by it. And basically, the bottom line is that everybody, when they talk about resurrection, they're talking about a dead corpse coming back to life, essentially. That's the bottom line. So it's not a metaphor. It doesn't mean you become a spirit who goes to heaven or anything like that. It's a physical thing that happens to the body that lies in the grave. Okay, so with that being the case, let me go ahead and launch into my argument for the resurrection, and let's hope it doesn't take too long. So in the previous videos, I talked about how given messianic expectations about a Davidic king, a crucifixion should have proved to everybody that Jesus was not the Messiah. And if you were listening to me and you thought to yourself, well, wait a minute, Sam just proved that Jesus is not the Messiah. If that's what you were thinking, if you were thinking that I have already undermined Christianity, awesome. That's exactly where I want you to be right now. Because I want you to kind of step into the shoes of Jesus's disciples, who were all Jews, by the way. And they had this view of what a Messiah was supposed to be, or they had a reason for following Jesus. Jesus portrayed himself as being a certain type of Messiah, namely a king. And the Davidic Messiah was supposed to come along and usher in all these promises that God had made, that they would all be able to live in this land. So there's supposed to be this return from exile, not only of all the Jews who were living outside of the homeland, but the lost 10 tribes as well. So Judah and Israel was supposed to be reunited. There was supposed to be nobody oppressing the Jews anymore, so there shouldn't be any Roman occupiers. They're supposed to have sovereignty. The king is supposed to sit on the throne of David and reestablish that thing and rule forever. And there's supposed to be this era of peace and prosperity in which everything's going great. But instead of all that stuff happening, Jesus was crucified by the very people he should have prevailed against, namely the Romans. And so this raises the question of why anybody continued to believe in Jesus after all these things happened. Why would they continue to think he was the Messiah after he was killed? I also mentioned in previous videos that there were a bunch of other messianic movements, and some of them were quasi-messianic. They had hints of messianic stuff in them. And in each one of these cases, whenever the leader was killed, the movement ended immediately. Sometimes they would follow one of the brothers. There was a situation where I think there were two brothers who were both claiming to be Messiah. One of them got killed, and everybody went and followed the other one, and he got killed too. And so these messianic claimants throughout the first century culminated in the war in 66 to 70, in which you had multiple people claiming to be the Messiah. And in each case, whenever the Messiah was killed, that ended that movement. And then there was a final one, I think around in the 130s, Bar Kokhba. Same thing happened there. Once he died, that ended the movement. Christianity is the only movement that survived the death of the would-be Messiah. And so the big question is why? Why would anybody continue to believe that Jesus was the Messiah after he had been killed? Modern Jews also reject Jesus being the Messiah because of the crucifixion. That's one reason. The other reason is because Christians claim that Jesus was God, which is anathema to Jews. But one of the main reasons is because Jesus was killed without having fulfilled all these major prophecies. He didn't usher in peace and prosperity. He didn't sit on the throne of David. He didn't kick the Romans out. Not much changed, and now the temple's been destroyed too. So it doesn't look like things are going that great for the Jewish people. So why would anybody think Jesus was the Messiah who is supposed to usher in all these promises? I think I've hammered that point home enough. Well, the only reason they possibly could believe that is if they had some reason to think that he was still alive, in spite of having been dead. So in other words, a resurrection is necessary just to keep Christianity alive. And so the question then becomes, what reason would they have to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. After all, there's no obvious messianic prophecy about a Messiah who would die and then rise from the dead. So there's no reason for them to expect it. And the Gospels, Jesus does sometimes predict that he's going to die and be resurrected. But the Gospels all portray the disciples as not being able to wrap their heads around that. Now, when I used to read about that when I was a kid, I thought, boy, they're making the disciples out to be stupid here. Surely they weren't that stupid. Jesus made it plain to them. But now I know a little bit more, and it actually is not that hard to understand if you understand what a Messiah was expected to be. To claim that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, and then to say that he's going to go to Jerusalem, and instead of asserting authority and sitting on the throne and all this kind of stuff, he's going to get killed. I mean, that would have just sounded like nonsense to his followers. So of course they wouldn't be able to wrap their heads around that. And we see multiple things that happen throughout the course of events in the Gospels leading up to the death of Jesus that indicate that lost my train of thought. That indicate, I guess, that the disciples were having a hard time wrapping their heads around this. One is that some of them tried to make him king by force because Jesus wasn't asserting himself. You know, he was claiming to be the Messiah, but he wasn't like taking action, and everybody was getting a little bit anxious. Come on, man, do the thing. We're waiting for you. So they tried to make him king by force, and he didn't do it. Another one was when Jesus was being arrested. It says Peter drew out his sword and tried to protect Jesus, tried to stop it, you know. And Jesus like, well, Peter, you don't understand. There were a couple of times. There was at one point where it seemed like Jesus got through to Peter, you know, about the fact that he's going to die. And once it finally clicked to Peter what Jesus was saying, Peter's like, no, I'm never going to let that happen. And Jesus rebuked Peter. He said, get thee behind me, Satan, or something like that. And so Peter shut up at that point. But then once Jesus was killed, in spite of now I don't know what the historical probability is that Jesus actually made these predictions. It's possible that later Christians put that on Jesus's tongue, you know, just to make it look like Jesus was in control and he prophesied the whole thing. I don't know. I haven't really looked too deeply into the probability of that. But supposing he did say those things, it would, whether he said those things or not, it's pretty evident that once he was killed, that did destroy the movement, at least temporarily, because it says that all the disciples fled in fear of their lives. Peter denied Jesus, denied even knowing Jesus. There's a scene in Luke where these two disciples are on the road to Emmaus, and they said, well, we thought this was going to be the guy that would redeem Israel, but they were disappointed. And then later on, at the beginning of the book of Acts, just before Jesus ascended to heaven, some of the disciples were still confused. They said, are you going to restore the kingdom now? And he didn't, you know. So they were still, this whole time, they're still thinking the Messiah is going to, you know, fulfill all these promises immediately. There's a couple of places where it says that the disciples had a dispute among themselves about who was going to sit at Jesus's right hand when he took the throne, when he came into his kingdom and stuff like that. So you see all kinds of hints in the Gospels about what the disciples and everybody were expecting. They were expecting a real Davidic king to sit on the throne in Jerusalem and to rule, to kick out the Romans and everything. And this expectation continued even after Jesus was killed and resurrected. So given all that, it's understandable that they would lose hope after he was killed, because he didn't fulfill their expectations. And so they were devastated, probably. And this is one of those core things that I mentioned that E.P. Sanders says is one of the core facts that we can know fairly certain about the historical Jesus, that his disciples abandoned him at first, immediately fled for their lives and all this kind of stuff. So they immediately lost hope. But something caused them to regain that hope. And what they claimed happened was that Jesus appeared to them. He appeared to them alive again, and this restored their hope. And so that's how Christianity began. So now two questions come up. The first one is, did Jesus appear to them at all? And the second is, what was the nature of that appearance? Now, there's a lot of scholars fall into two camps here. Almost, I don't know if almost all, but the vast majority of scholars believe that the disciples did see something that caused them to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. E.P. Sanders says that Jesus, I don't have the book in front of me, so I'm quoting this from memory, so it's probably going to be not entirely accurate. He said that the disciples saw Jesus in some sense is fairly certain, but what the nature is of that seeing, I don't know, something like that. So he certainly saw something, he's just not sure what it is they saw. So scholars fall into two camps. Some say they saw something, but they don't know what it is they saw. They just know that it led to belief that Jesus had raised from the dead. And the second thing is that a lot of them will say that it must have been some kind of vision or hallucination. And what's his name? Sorry, Dr. Pepper and all. The German scholar, can't think of his name right now, but I could probably put a name right there. But he's this guy whose name I'm not telling you is famous for promoting this hallucination hypothesis. And the basis for the hallucination hypothesis is the fact that grief hallucinations are fairly common. I don't remember what the statistics are, something like 25%, 15 to 25%, something like that, of people who have a loved one die will have some kind of experience pretty soon afterwards in which it seems like that person appears to them in some way. And there are people in my personal life who that has happened to. Happened to my grandmother. She used to tell this story all the time about how, after the funeral when my granddaddy died, she was in the kitchen and she felt the presence of her husband and God. And although her husband, she didn't see anything, but she felt the presence. And then she heard a voice from God saying, don't be afraid, I'll never leave you alone. And she used to tell that story all the time. She'd get choked up every time she would tell it. But anyway, I have some other people in my life who also claim to have had experiences of a loved one that died. I don't want to go into that because it's a little too personal. It's a little bit too close. My grandmother's been dead for a long time. But the closest thing I ever had was I had a really lucid dream after my dad died. He didn't appear to me while I was awake, but I had a really lucid dream about him. Interesting story. I had a lucid dream about another loved one too that I won't go into. But anyway, grief hallucinations are fairly common, and so one of the things people say is that the disciples had these grief hallucinations, and that's what led them to believe in the resurrection. Well, one of the arguments against that is that the appearances happened in groups, and you can't have a group of people having the same hallucination. That doesn't happen because hallucinations are first person private. They only happen in your head. And so two people are not going to hallucinate the same thing. Well, I don't think that's the strongest argument, because there are situations that we know of in which people see things in groups that aren't necessarily really there. People used to see Elvis, Marian apparitions, or people see faces in clouds, or Mother Teresa in a cinnamon roll. So there are a lot of situations like a shadow on a wall or something on a piece of glass or something, where it used to make the news all the time back in the 90s and stuff, where somebody will see an angel or Mother Teresa or something, and it'll look similar to it, but that's a situation where people see something that's not really there, but they kind of just if we were both looking at the clouds and you didn't see a face and I did, and I said, hey, do you see the face? And I pointed out its nose and its eyes and stuff, and you might say, oh yeah, I see it now. It could have been that kind of thing. So that kind of group, that's not strictly speaking a hallucination, I guess, but it's some kind of visionary thing. So So I guess people are right that hallucinations don't happen in groups, but that doesn't mean that groups couldn't have seen something that they took to be Jesus or something like that. So let me go through the appearance traditions. I mentioned in an earlier video when I was talking about sources, I said you got the Gospels on the one hand, and they were written anywhere from the late 60s to the 90s, Mark through John. And then earlier than that, you've got Paul's letters, and Paul's letters were written between the late 40s to the early to mid 60s, mostly in the 50s. But we have earlier sources than that because Paul quotes oral traditions and hymns and like statements of faith and things like that are all embedded in his letters, and some of them we can easily recognize. And these all predate Paul's letters. And one of the earliest ones, maybe possibly the earliest one, is quoted in 1 Corinthians 15. And this one we can also easily recognize it as being an oral tradition because of the way Paul introduces it. He says, now keep in mind that he founded the Corinthian church around 50, and then this letter was written around 55. But he says, I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you, on which you believed, etc. I don't remember the exact words. And then he says, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. Or, I passed on to you as of first importance what I also received. Something like that. And then he says that Christ died for sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. And he says that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to 500 witnesses, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And finally, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. So, L. Michael Wright, in his book, From Jesus to Christianity, something like that, I can't remember the name of the book. But he goes into kind of detail about this formula. And one of the things he says is, and you can see this on all the sources about this formula, about how it's introduced with the words, I received and I passed on to you. This terminology, I received and I passed on to you, or I passed on to you what I received, it shows up both ways. It shows up in a lot of rabbinic literature, and it's kind of a technical way of introducing oral tradition, formalized oral tradition. And the use of the word that operates in Greek kind of like our quotation marks. So you say, I passed on to you what I also received, that Christ died for sins, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day. So the word that tells you what the content is of that oral tradition. So the oral tradition includes Jesus dying for sins, being buried, being raised from the dead, and I think it includes the appearance to Peter and to the 12. I'm not sure if that appearance is a separate thing or not. But then after that, Paul starts saying other things that are not part of that original oral tradition. One thing he says is that Jesus appeared to the 500. And then after that, he says that Jesus appeared to James and then to all the apostles. And then he says that Jesus appeared to Paul himself. So in the book of Galatians, Paul talks a little bit about his conversion and his travels. He was converted pretty early on after Jesus died, possibly within a year. And then 3 years later, 3 years after his conversion, he went to visit Peter in Jerusalem. And he says that he stayed with Peter for 15 days, and he also talked to James. And James is the brother of Jesus. And he went there to talk about the gospel. So now, in 1 Corinthians 15, years later, Paul is reciting this oral tradition that he calls the gospel, and he's got 2 appearances, one in which it says he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, and the other in which he says he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. So given the fact that he met with Peter and James to talk about the gospel, and now he's rehearsing this oral tradition about the gospel in which he appeared to Peter and James, tells a lot of people, possibly most scholars, that Peter got this formula from those apostles. He got it from Peter and James. And so Pinchas Lapide, who is a Jewish scholar who used to teach at a university or something in Germany, I think, he's dead now, but he wrote a book on the resurrection of Jesus. And he said that given how it seems that Paul acquired these oral traditions, that these are as good as statements from Peter and James themselves about these appearances. So they're, as good as eyewitness testimony about the resurrection of Jesus. There's another place in 1 Corinthians where, I think it's either 1 Corinthians or Romans. It's 1 Corinthians, I'm pretty sure, where Paul says, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? And so you get the impression from this passage that seeing the Lord is one of the prerequisites to being an apostle. So if Paul believed that seeing the Lord was one of the prerequisites to being an apostle, and he also believed that Peter and James and John and all the others were apostles, then Paul must have believed that these people saw Jesus. And so the fact that he knew these people personally and he talked to them about the gospel makes it pretty, I don't want to say certain, because that gives you the idea that it's 100% certainty, and nothing in history is 100% certain. But it's very highly likely that, beyond a reasonable doubt, I guess you could say, that these apostles told Paul that they had seen Jesus. And they talked about these appearances. Surely they talked about these things if they're talking about the gospel. So we can be fairly confident that Peter, James, the other apostles, and Paul all at least claim to have seen Jesus. Now the question now becomes, and these appearances had to have been the reason for why they changed their minds, because there's not any other reason that were ever given for why they continued to believe Jesus was the Messiah. In the case of Paul in the early times when Christianity was just beginning, he was a Pharisee, and he was opposed to Christianity. He tried to end it, but he had some Damascus Road experience, literally, in which Jesus appeared to them, and this completely turned things around for him. Well, it appears as if things turned around for James as well, because there are indications in the Gospels that James, the brother of Jesus, was not a believer in Jesus during Jesus's earthly ministry. In fact, in the Gospels, it says at one point that his siblings thought he was crazy. But James had an appearance. There's a gospel that's lost to us now called the Gospel of the Hebrews, that was written in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, that is quoted by some of the early church fathers. And in this account, it gives us more details about the appearance of James. It tells us in there that James's conversion was caused by this appearance and stuff. And that makes good historical sense. Imagine your own brother claiming to be the Messiah. You might think he's crazy, and then imagine he dies. What would it take to get you to believe your own brother is the Messiah? Something like appearance would seem to be necessary. So, as far as grief hallucinations are concerned, it seems unlikely that all of the apostles would have grief hallucinations. Usually it happens to individuals, and it's kind of random. If you have 12 people and there's a 25% chance that somebody's going to have a grief hallucination, it's unlikely that all 12 of them are. Yet here we have an appearance tradition that Jesus appeared to all 12, and it appears to have happened in groups. Now let me say something about the 500 witnesses, because this one is interesting for two reasons. One, it shows up in our very earliest source. Now, this is not part of the oral tradition that Paul is quoting, because Paul makes the parenthetical comment that most of them are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Obviously, that couldn't have been part of a fixed oral tradition, because as time goes on, more and more people are going to die. And if that was a fixed oral tradition, you would have to keep updating that parenthetical comment. Some have died, most have fallen asleep, and then later on, most have fallen asleep, though some are still around, or something like that. So Paul seems to have some information that there was this, and according to Paul, this was a group hallucination. He appeared to all 500 at one time. So it's the earliest source, and the fact that Paul makes this parenthetical comment gives you an idea that Paul must have some kind of rough idea of who some of these people are. to have been able to say that most of them are still living, though some have fallen asleep, i.e. died. So Paul must have talked to somebody who claimed to have been a part of this group of 500 people. But this appearance to 500 people doesn't show up anywhere else. In the Gospels, you have various appearances to the disciples and even some to the women, but no appearance to 500 people. I think there's one source, I can't remember where, possibly in Acts, where Jesus appeared to 120 people, I think, but not to 500. So what are we to make of that? One argument is that it didn't happen because if it had happened, surely they would have mentioned that in the Gospels. And that's reasonable. But it's also reasonable to think that the Gospels gave a very truncated view of the appearances because, as it says at the end of John, if everything that Jesus did was written down, there wouldn't be enough books in the world, or there wouldn't be a big enough library to contain all the books or something like that. So it's likely, according to Luke, Jesus appeared to them over a period of 40 years, or not 40 years, but 40 days. And so it's likely there were a whole bunch of appearances, and the gospel writers just chose, each of them chose different appearances, for their own purposes. And they wanted to have them appear to the group of 12 apostles because those are the people who are going to go out and plant churches and start the movement. An apostle, by the way, is basically the same thing as a missionary. The word apostolos means a sent one, somebody who is sent out. And so the apostles were people that were personally commissioned by Jesus to go out and preach the gospel. And that's why an appearance to Jesus you had to have Jesus appear to you in order to be an apostle, because he has to personally commission you. But lost my train of thought again. Let's see if I can get it back. I have completely lost my train of thought. I don't know where I was. So let me get back to these appearances and say that I think that I don't know whether Jesus appeared to 500 people at once or not. I can't demonstrate that from the evidence, but I do think, given what Paul said, that there must have been an appearance involving a large group of people. If there were enough people around telling Paul about this, that Paul was able to make this parenthetical comment that most were still living and some had fallen asleep, then there must have been multiple people telling Paul about this major appearance. And maybe Paul made up the word 500. Maybe it's an estimate. Maybe somebody else told him 500. Maybe multiple people told him different numbers. Maybe one said it was 100 people. Maybe one said 500. Who knows how he came up with that number? Regardless of what the number is, it does seem likely that Jesus appeared to a large group of people. And it also seems, if we take the Gospels at face value, that Jesus did appear to at least some of the disciples in groups. And so we have multiple independent attestation of appearances that happen not just to individuals, but to groups and stuff like that. And so now the question becomes whether an appearance alone would be sufficient to explain why they came to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, when they didn't expect him to, especially in the case of James and Paul. In reality, all of the disciples can be considered people who needed to be converted by an appearance because they had all lost hope. And so in a sense, they were all unbelievers. And then they were all converted by the appearance of Jesus. Well, I don't think that a hallucination by itself is sufficient to explain that, or a vision or anything like that. So let's go back to Marian apparitions. The fact that a bunch of people saw Mary, and I don't doubt that large groups of people saw what they took to be Mary. I don't doubt that. The evidence is pretty solid for that. The question is what they saw and how did they interpret it. None of them interpreted it as being evidence that Mary had risen from the dead. And in the case of Elvis sightings that used to be popular back in the late 80s and early 90s, it didn't lead anybody to believe that Elvis had risen from the dead. And grief hallucinations never lead people to believe that their loved one has risen from the dead. And this is significant because of how common they are. If 25% of the people have group hallucinations, and again, I'm not certain about what the fraction of people is, It's 15 to 25%, somewhere around there. But if that many people, generation after generation after generation, all over the world, have grief hallucinations, and it never leads to the belief that their loved one has risen from the dead, then clearly a hallucination is not sufficient to explain why the disciples came to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. There has to be something more, because there are multiple options. If you think about what you would think if you saw somebody that you knew to be dead, maybe you went to their funeral, maybe it's a loved one or something like that. Try to picture what you would think if that person was standing in front of you right now. What would you think? What would you make of that? I mean, probably with a lot of us, the first thing we would think is, I've gone crazy. Or you would think, maybe you'd think you're having a dream. Maybe you would think you were hallucinating. Maybe you would think it's a ghost. There are all kinds of options you would have, but the last thing you would think is that this person had risen from the dead. Maybe you might even think they never died. Maybe there had been some mistake. They hadn't died at all. But the last thing you would ever conclude is that they had risen from the dead. It would take a lot more to get you to believe that. Well, we see that in the Gospels. There's an instance in Luke where Jesus made an appearance, I think, by the Sea of Galilee, and the first thing that popped in their mind is that they were seeing a ghost. They thought Jesus was a ghost. But Jesus corrected them by saying, a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones as you see that I have. And Thomas said that he wouldn't believe it until he saw the scars in Jesus' hand and stuck his finger in the wound in his side and stuff like that. Paul wanted tangible proof that Jesus had risen, or not Paul. Thomas wanted tangible proof that Jesus had risen from the dead. And then you see in I think the letter 1 John, where it says, what we have seen, what we have touched, what we have felt with our hands, this we proclaim to you, or something like that. So you have all this emphasis in the appearances and the Gospels and 1 John about, they emphasize all this, the tangibleness of Jesus, that they touched him, they felt him. And that makes good sense, because it would require something like that before you would believe your dead loved one had risen from the dead. There's another instance, there's another story in Acts where Peter gets arrested and he's put in prison, and everybody thinks that he died or something, and then later on he's knocking on their door. He had been released miraculously from prison, but nobody knew about it yet. So they're all in this house, and Peter comes knocking on the door, and they were all afraid to open the door because they thought it must be Peter's ghost. And they were, people are afraid of ghosts, so they didn't want to answer the door. But having Peter sit there and knock on the door was not enough to make them think Peter had risen from the dead. So obviously it takes more to believe that. So this tells us that if Christianity was to survive the death of Jesus, they had to have good reason to believe that Jesus was physically raised from the dead. Because as I mentioned in a previous video, that's what resurrection means. A dead body comes back to life. If Jesus had appeared to them as a ghost, that would not have led them to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, because rising from the dead involves a corpse coming back to life. Now, to bolster this belief in a physical resurrection, we can look at the evidence for the burial and empty tomb. The burial and the empty tomb by themselves don't tell you that there's a resurrection, because there's such a thing as grave robbery, and apparently grave robbery was not that uncommon back then, because people would take dead bodies and use their parts for like magical properties or things like that. And I guess if Jesus was known as a wonder worker and prophet and everything, I mean, I guess some people would have a motive to want to steal his body. Now, there are some people that deny that he was buried at all, because it was pretty common for the Roman people to want to leave people on the cross, first of all, because the whole purpose of crucifixion was to be as a warning to any other would-be revolutionary type crazy people to not do that, because you'll get crucified, and that sucks. But in Deuteronomy, there's a law in there that says you can't leave somebody hanging on a tree overnight or something like that. So it's understandable that the Jewish people would want to remove people from the cross, especially since it was the eve of Passover. They would not have wanted to have these dead criminals on the cross in Jerusalem during this Passover thing. So it's understandable that they would want to remove them. And we also know from multiple sources that the Romans did allow Jewish people to remove people from crosses to bury them before nightfall. And in the Gospels, we have four Gospels, and in all four of them, one of the members of the Sanhedrin who had condemned Jesus to death and turned them over to Pilate, one of the members requested the body of Jesus from Pilate so that he could bury it. Well, that makes sense that a Sanhedrin member would want to do that, because they wouldn't want to leave dead bodies on a cross during Passover. And it makes sense that Pilate would allow them to do that, because we have evidence that Romans allowed Jews to do this. I was watching a video by Inspiring Philosophy or something like that recently, and he has a whole video on this where he cites multiple sources of instances where the Romans did allow Jews to take people off the cross and bury them. And so all four Gospels have Joseph of Arimathea putting Jesus in a tomb. I think in one of the Gospels it says the tomb actually belonged to Joseph. But it makes sense that they would want to do that kind of hastily before nightfall, because once nightfall comes, that's the beginning of the Sabbath, if it was the next day was the Sabbath, or it's the beginning of the day of Passover, which they'd want to do it before nightfall. So the burial incident makes sense. And also in that oral tradition, I forgot to mention, if Paul got this oral tradition from Peter and James on that first visit to Jerusalem, that happened 3 years after his conversion, and his conversion happened maybe 1 year after Jesus died, maybe as far as 2 years. So at the very latest, this oral tradition dates to about 5 years after Jesus. There's a whole slew of scholars that date this oral tradition anywhere from James Dunn dates it to within months after Jesus' death, and they date it all the way to 5 years after Jesus' death. So there's a whole lot of scholars that date this anywhere from a few months to a few years after Jesus' death. So it's a very early oral tradition. And one of the aspects of that oral tradition is it says that he was buried, that Jesus was buried. Now, it does not say in that oral tradition that he was buried in a tomb, but a tomb would make sense, because it's a whole lot quicker and easier to throw somebody in a tomb that's already empty than it is to dig a grave. So he probably was put in a tomb. And then you've got all the evidence for the empty tomb. And the evidence for the empty tomb is, first of all, if Jesus was put in a tomb and then they thought he was raised from the dead, that would naturally have implied an empty tomb, because resurrections, as we explained in a previous video, involves a physical body coming back to life and leaving the grave. So if it was in a tomb and then he was raised from the dead, you would expect the tomb to be empty. So that's probably why it's not mentioned in that oral tradition, because it would have been redundant to say he was buried, the empty tomb, and then he was raised, or he was buried and then he was raised and there was an empty tomb. Well, obviously there was an empty tomb. I mean, if I said I went to bed and I got up the next morning and my bed was empty, it would be silly for me to say my bed was empty, because the fact that I got out of bed itself would imply that the bed was empty. So that would be redundant. So that's probably why it's not in that oral tradition. But we have multiple independent attestation about the tomb being empty. Now in the Gospels, well, let me talk about the 3-day motive and the first day motive. We have two different ways that people talk about the timing of the resurrection of Jesus. In some places, it says he was raised on the 3rd day. In other places, it says he was raised on the 1st day of the week. Well, if he died on a Friday, then Sunday would have been the 3rd day, according to Jewish reckoning. If you count Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, that's the 3rd day. So the 1st day of the week and the 3rd day would have been the same day. But why date the resurrection of Jesus at this particular time? Well, the best explanation is because that's probably when the tomb was discovered to be empty. And according to all 4 Gospels, that's when the tomb was discovered to be empty. And another thing is that it says that the tomb was discovered to be empty by a group of Jesus's female followers. I think some of the Gospels say one of them, some of them say a group of them. I don't remember which is which. But a lot of people think that this fits the criteria of embarrassment, because if women were not the first to, let me get my train of thought here. Starting to lose my train of thought. It looks like I'm up to 45 minutes. I hope I don't run out of room on my thing. But anyway, so imagine you're in the ancient world and you're reading these Gospels and you're not a Christian or something. If you read these Gospels and you saw that women discovered the tomb empty, the first thing that would enter your mind would be, wait a minute, you're telling me that this whole story originated with a bunch of silly women? The gospel would lose credibility, because you had women, you had claimed that this whole thing got started by women discovering the tomb empty. So the fact that the gospel writers all say that women discovered the empty tomb is evidence that the tomb was in fact found empty, because if it wasn't found empty and somebody wanted to make up a story, they would not have made up a story in which women discovered the tomb empty, because that would cause the whole story to lose credibility, since the women would be the sole witnesses of the empty tomb. And one of the Gospels, I think the Gospel of John, it actually has Peter and John run to check out, to make sure the women were telling the truth. But in the other Gospels, I think the women are the only ones that ever see the empty tomb. I failed to mention at this point that we have both Roman and Jewish sources that kind of poo-poo the testimony of women. They kind of treat women as if they have no credibility at all. And so that's why it's significant that the Gospels report that women were the first to discover the tomb empty. So let's see. Other arguments for the empty tomb. There are other arguments for the empty tomb, but I'm not thinking of them. I can't believe I forgot to mention this. But in Matthew's gospel, it says that there's this rumor going around that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. And Matthew said this rumor exists to this day. And he attempted to refute that rumor. But the fact that he was just attempting to refute that rumor does tell you that that rumor existed. And the existence of that rumor tells you that even non-Christians were admitting that the tomb was empty. Now, we don't know necessarily that they knew firsthand that it was empty, or if they were just simply taking the Christian's word for it. But that does give us at least some additional reason to suspect that the tomb was found empty. So, wanted to include that in the video. But it doesn't matter. The resurrection doesn't hang on the empty tomb. Even if there was no tomb that was found empty, the appearances and stuff were enough to establish that Jesus appeared to them in a tangible form, and that's what convinced them that he was raised from the dead. So I guess I could go into objections to the resurrection, but I think if I do that, I'm going to do that in a different video, because this one's already 47 minutes long. That is essentially my argument for the resurrection of Jesus. It's essentially that Christianity would not have survived as a messianic movement if Jesus had not risen from the dead, because a dead Messiah would have proved that he was not the Messiah, and that would have ended the movement. And hallucinations or just appearances or visionary things would not have been sufficient to convince anybody that Jesus has risen from the dead. So it must have been a real tangible experience that they could all touch. And we have multiple independent eyewitness testimony that they all saw Jesus, and that the seeing is what renewed their faith. Or in the case of Paul or James, it converted them to Christianity. And so I think we have pretty good reason to believe that the resurrection happened. You could object to it on naturalistic grounds, but that's why I have previous videos where I argued against naturalism. I also have a video where I addressed general arguments against miracles and stuff like that. So I've already addressed those objections. One of the objections might be that Jesus didn't really die. Well, if he didn't really die, first of all, that's unlikely to happen, because the way crucifixion works is, you're up on a cross and stuff, and it's very hard to breathe when you're in this position. So to breathe, you have to kind of push yourself up to breathe. Well, if you're doing that for a long period of time, eventually you're going to get exhausted and you're going to die. And in the case of Jesus was crucified with two other people. And according to the Gospels, they wanted to have them all buried before nightfall. So to speed along their deaths, they broke the legs of the other two guys so that they wouldn't be able to push themselves up to breathe, so that they would die quicker. And when they got to Jesus, he was already dead. So just to make sure, they stuck him with a spear. There's only one instance in all of our evidence that anybody ever survived a crucifixion. And this was a situation during the war in which Josephus was walking around. And he saw 3 of his friends on crosses, and he went and talked to Titus and asked Titus if he could take them down. And Titus says, yeah, take them down, give them the best medical care. And they got the best medical care. And of the 3, only one of them survived. The other 2 died. Well, that didn't happen to Jesus. Nobody took Jesus down early and gave him a doctor. They took him down because they thought he was dead and put him in a tomb. Well, if they thought he was dead, then obviously he could not have been pulling himself up to breathe, because that would have made the fact that he was alive very obvious. So if he appeared to be dead, that means that he had to have been totally relaxed, which means that he could not have been breathing. And so even if he was just totally collapsed from exhaustion and wasn't moving, if he wasn't dead already, he would have been dead within a couple of minutes, because he wouldn't have been able to get any oxygen. He would have suffocated, So it's almost impossible that he didn't die. And even if he did survive the cross and was put in a tomb and then later appeared to his apostles, that would not have led them to believe that he had conquered death in any kind of glorious way, because he would have been in horrible medical condition. They would have wanted to get him a doctor or something, and that could not have been what gave them hope for their own resurrection. Because imagine Jesus appearing to them, in this horrible bloody state, and say, "Hey, if you believe in me, you can have a body like mine. You can be resurrected just like me." That wouldn't have instilled hope in anybody. And so there are a lot of other theories. Mike Licona has this book called The Resurrection of Jesus that I highly recommend, and he compares the evidence for the resurrection, or he compares the resurrection hypothesis to multiple other hypotheses that try to explain all this data. And what he comes up with is the resurrection, if you apply certain criteria, certain historical criteria, like like being less ad hoc, having explanatory scope, explanatory power, all these different criteria, the resurrection is worlds above all these other hypotheses. The hallucination hypothesis is one of them, and I explain why that one doesn't work. The resurrection explains the evidence better than any other hypothesis. So I guess that's about all I have to say. I'll recommend 2 books. One book is by N.T. Wright. It's called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And the other is by Mike Licona. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus, I think. So that's all I'm going to say about the resurrection. I'll do another video tomorrow I'll do another video tomorrow. So hang on, because I'm not done with my defense of Christianity. I've got more to say about it tomorrow.